So there are some people in this room that are not fisheries biologists. There are botanists and wildlife biologists and soil scientists. Oh, Rudy's up there going, don't forget the soil scientists, I'll get you. What we wanted to do with this next talk is be sure that we highlighted the other species, the other functions of the riparian reserves that are the non-fish stuff. I think you heard Dave Kretzing this morning talk very clearly about how riparian reserve prescriptions needed to be interdisciplinary. And I think Martin Raphael is going to help us see why that is. Marty is a research scientist with P&W Station in Olympia, and he's going to talk about the function of riparian reserves for terrestrial species. What was the original intent written in the ROD? So help me welcome Martin Raphael. It does.
So I'm going to take you on a walk down history lane here and sort of go back to what was maybe in the minds of FEMAT and other organizations when the plan was developed. I'm going to take kind of a broad conceptual approach to this. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of individual species, but hopefully it'll give you a feel for some of the motivations. Now to start with, when FEMAT was formed, there was a charter that provided the guidance for that, and in that charter were some major objectives. One of those objectives, I'm going to quote here, was for maintenance and/or restoration of habitat conditions to support viable populations well distributed across their current ranges of species known or thought to be associated with old growth forest conditions. So the whole thing revolved around population viability, and of course population viability is a tough subject. In the forest plan and under as federal land managers, what that was intended to manage habitat. And so there are some general sort of ecology 101 conservation biology principles that tie the likelihood of population viability to habitat conditions and things like this. You know, species that are well distributed across the range are less prone to extinction. Larger blocks of habitat are superior to smaller blocks to allow for species persistence. Blocks that are closer together are better than ones that are more spread apart. And blocks that are connected to each other are better than isolated blocks. So that was some of the conceptual underpinning that was in the minds of people as they tried to assess the relative contributions of the various alternatives that were being developed. So those alternatives started with the FEMAT document, and then I'll go into some reasons for the formation of some additional teams and work to sort of focus in on species that weren't so well protected under what became the forest plan. That was this Appendix J2 in the final EIS, and that information went into the final impact statement, and then that was what was in the record of decision, and the record of decision is what really describes the forest plan as we now know it. So if you think back, there were 10 alternatives that were being considered at the time under FEMAT, and they varied in the amount of late successional old growth forest that was being conserved under each alternative. So if you look at the heights of those green and blue and dark green bars, those vary among the different alternatives. Alternative 9 was the one that ultimately became the Northwest Forest Plan, and it had sort of an intermediate level of total amount of old forest that was conserved. You'll notice that blue bar is the amount of old forest contained within the riparian reserve system, and also for option 9, that amount was about intermediate with some of the other alternatives. So originally in FEMAT, there were a number of I'm simplifying here, but a number of different considerations that describe the riparian buffer system. And you heard these earlier this morning, but for fish-bearing streams, the buffer would be 2 tree heights, and there was a sort of the alternative distance if it was greater. For permanent non-fish-bearing streams, there was a 1 tree height buffer. Intermittent streams within key watersheds, 1 tree height, but now notice this last one, in intermittent streams outside of those key watersheds, in the FEMAT document, that was set for 1/2 tree height. So that's what went into the viability assessments that were subsequently undertaken. Now those assessments were done by teams of taxonomic experts that met together. There were, somewhere in the 5 to 8 people per team associated with specific taxonomic groups like insects, like amphibians, like reptiles. Those panels were given a bunch of information about the options, you know, the nature of the reserve system, the nature of the riparian system. Their task was to look at the full complement of all the features of these alternatives as they were explained, and to assess the likelihood of species falling into one of four outcomes. The outcomes range from it could go extinct with high likelihood, or they would be stable and well distributed with some likelihood. The alternatives were scored, and the scores were sort of likelihood points. So if you thought a species was going to have a high likelihood of persistence out for the next 100 years, all the points would go into that outcome A, which is stable and well distributed. The scores were tabulated among those panelists, they were averaged, and then there was a bunch of additional information collected about what went into the score so that we had some knowledge about the factors that were being considered. So here's just one example of outcome scores for one species. This is the red tree vole, and you have these four different outcomes, the likelihood percentages that you see on the right over there. So if this one had scored really badly, we would have seen some orange color in there, which would have been a high likelihood of extirpation. We didn't see that in any alternative here. It could be constrained to small refugia, and you'll see in some of the options, including option 9, the Northwest Forest Plan, there was some likelihood that that could happen. There's the patchy distribution, that's the green bar, and you can see in option 9 there was a fairly high possibility of that. And then a stable, well-distributed population, that was the percentage you see in dark blue. To tabulate this overall, we needed to have some way of saying there was a high likelihood of persistence and viability. And for the purposes of that exercise, 80% likelihood in outcome A was that benchmark. So you see here that under option 9, this species fell below an 80% level of that stable distribution. So that kicked it into some other process. Now just to describe why the administration was concerned about that, here's a relationship between a viability index, which is essentially the expected number of viable species, and the proportion of land that's open to harvest in the matrix. And the inverse of that, of course, would be the amount in reserves. So we see here that option 1, the one on my side, was the option that preserved the most old growth forest, and that had the highest overall percentage of viable species. Option 9, which is down here toward the other end, at the low end of the scale, right over here, that fell below that point. And when the lawyers associated with this process took a look at this fall down in viability, they were concerned that in this litigious environment that the forest plan emerged from, that if we had an option that showed some low likelihoods of viability for a large number of species, that option would not be able to pass legal challenges. So they asked the EIS team to convene a panel of people, some of whom had been involved with FEMAT, some were new to it, to look at ways that option 9 could be tweaked, if you will, to try to raise those viability levels up to at least that of, say, option 1. So this panel was convened, and they first looked at this whole list of species, and I'll show you a table of how many there were, there was a lot, that required additional analysis because they fell below that 80% likelihood level. And then the panel described the basis for the reason why it might have fallen below that level, but then importantly described some potential mitigations that could be put in place that might raise that level back up to above that 80%. Described the benefits of the mitigation and then summarized those mitigation measures for consideration by the final impact statement planners. So all of this is documented in one of the appendices of the EIS. The thing is about 500 pages long. There's a ton of information in that appendix. Those consolidated mitigations these are summarized as we see here. There were 3 of them that ultimately became the Survey and Manage program that you may remember. There were 5 of them that were different versions of riparian reserves, adding buffer widths and tweaking reserves. There were 2 more that had to do with some additional watershed protections. There were 6 different mitigations that had to do with special management in the matrix, increasing the amount of dead wood that was retained, increasing the amount of intact forest that would be left and so on. And then a few other measures as well. But looking at the riparian reserve mitigations, they were, those 5 of them had to do with different variations in the way the buffers would be configured. And one of those, if you look in the middle of this list, number 6, was to apply the full riparian with buffers on intermittent, oh, it's not number 6, it's, which one are we talking about? Number 7. Anyway, the idea was rather than go with those half-width buffers on non-fish-bearing streams and intermittent streams outside of key watersheds, to apply that riparian buffer width everywhere. And as it turned out, that particular mitigation covered a large number of species, and when the administration started thinking about how to mix and match all of these different potential lists of mitigations, that's the one that emerged with having sort of the greatest bang for the buck, and it was put into place because it provided such a large amount of additional protection. Now, I'm not asking you to read this matrix, but this is a summary table that was in that appendix where every single one of the over 1,000 species were listed as rows in the matrix, and the specific mitigation that would benefit that species was listed as a column in the matrix, and then the type of protection that would be afforded that species was the number within each cell. And those numbers varied. A low number would indicate that, boy, if you did that provision, it would totally benefit the species, and others were scored saying that that mitigation is essentially irrelevant for the species. So when you tally that all up, in FEMAT, the first task there was to assemble a list of all the species that were associated with old forest. And there was over 1,000 that you see listed among these different species groups: bryophytes, fungi, lichen, etc., down to amphibians, fish, birds, bats, and other mammals. So of those 1,120 species that were originally considered, there were 490 that failed in that initial screen, that had viability levels that were below that threshold that had been set. And then that's the list that was tabulated in this Appendix J2. Well, of those 490, 130 were those that would benefit from this proposed alterations to the riparian buffer system. So, you know, those 5 different versions that I described. So that means that almost 25% of all the species whose viability levels fell could be provided for under these changed riparian systems. So just some I just pulled a few examples of these out of the book. So one of them has to do with riparian lichens. And in that case, if you read the text in this appendix, it was saying that full width buffers, that using the full site potential tree rather than half a site potential tree, would provide connectivity and larger patch sizes of the appropriate host species for this particular lichen. So it's an example of one of these terrestrial benefits. Another one, terrestrial salamanders. This happens to be a torrent salamander a streamside salamander, and this is a torrent that I'm showing here. The description talks about full buffers would maintain cool, clear water conditions critical for foraging and for thermal regulation. Another example, this one more terrestrial, the red tree vole. In that case, those full buffers would provide added connectivity among patches of old forest in matrix lands. The idea there, red tree voles are fairly poor dispersers, and adding that additional connectivity would add connectivity among the patches, lead to sort of satisfying those conservation biology principles that I described in the first place. Another one, American marten. In this case, the buffers would provide for connectivity just as it would for a red tree vole, but that's an animal that forages along streams in many, many cases, and it finds better denning habitat in some of the downed wood and standing dead wood that occurs along those stream side environments. So it protects some of those patches in old forest along streams. So all this information was assembled. It was presented to that team. It was run through the justice lawyers that were advising the team at the time. And a decision was made to implement that full riparian reserve scenario on all streams, as I said before, because that was one of the mitigations that would provide really the most benefit for that list of species that was considered to be at unacceptable risk. And so then that was the design of the riparian system that was embodied in the record of decision and made part of the plan. So the bottom line from all this is that this whole thing was based upon this concept of species viability, and the decision to increase buffer widths was an attempt to increase that likelihood of viability so that it would have a higher likelihood of meeting the original objectives that were set forth when the plan was first envisioned. So those buffers were meant to reduce the risk of extirpation for that approximately 130 terrestrial species that were associated with old forests, but that would benefit from the greater protection of that forest that would be afforded by those bigger buffers along streams and streamside forest. So that's how we got here. Thanks.
Thank you, Marty.
Do we want to do
We got time for questions. Okay. For Marty, who are lecturers. We got a panel too, but in the back.
So when managers want to go in and thin and manage in riparian areas, do they put 130 terrestrial species at risk?
Not necessarily. The question is, if a manager wanted to go in and thin along riparian zones, would they put those 130 species at risk? And in that case, the answer is you could, but you'd have to describe what it is in that particular area that that thinning would do to the habitat conditions for the species that occur there. And that creates a whole bunch of logistical issues because just knowing what occurs there is not an easy thing to describe. But,
and if you were going to reduce the size of the riparian area, wouldn't you have to know what those 130 species are and the effects that it would have on them?
Well, my guess is that that would have to be considered, yeah. Because it's all, if you go back to the original reason those were put in the first place, it was to alleviate those viability concerns. And if you're going to change those viability likelihoods, there ought to be some way to describe what those changes might be. You know, this just reminds me of one thing. It's hard to predict what those changes are going to do. And earlier, one of the questions had to do with thinning and reserves and how it would affect marble murrelet habitat. And the idea came up, well, you could build larger limbs faster if you had thin trees that grew faster, and that's a good thing for marble murrelets. But there's the old law of unintended consequences. Creating more diverse understories that you would in that kind of thinning could create better conditions for predators that depredate marble murrelet nests. And so it's a two-edged sword. You make better nests, but then the nests are likely to fail because there are more predators in there. So these things are never going to be simple when you're dealing with large suites of species, multiple interacting factors. And it'd be impossible for me to come up with an easy answer saying, oh yeah, it's good, or yeah, it's bad.
May I add to that? You have a question?
So I have a question. So Marty, the riparian reserve boundaries were interim, they weren't final. How did that factor into this analysis?
The comment was those riparian reserve boundaries were interim, they weren't final. How did that factor into the analysis? And I think the analysts were thinking of those buffers in place as if they were permanent, and that they would change only if there was reason to think that those changes would not be to the detriment of the species being considered.
Wasn't it in 1994 when those were first developed, wasn't that in response to the clear-cut harvesting? I mean, you have to put it in context at that time as well.
Yes, well the comment was when this was first put into place, wasn't that in response to the issues surrounding clear-cut harvesting? So, you know, there was the Monongahela decision, and there was the Forest Management Act, and then there was the planning rule associated with that act. And all this was done in the context of that planning rule, the 1982 planning rule, that called for maintaining viable populations, and it called for maintaining a high likelihood of viability. So that was the sort of legal legislative context under which all this was being considered too. Now, of course, we're under a new planning rule, and maybe things would be assessed somewhat differently.
Let's come back to you.